Good afternoon and welcome to my presentation on social media being used as a news source. Today I will be presenting on social media being used as a news source while referencing the Ukraine war as a case study. For the benefit of the presentation, my student number and my name are listed on the screen also. So moving on to a brief introduction on what we will be covering today. So we'll be covering an introduction, defining the key terms, the advantages, disadvantages, and finally conclusion. So the aims and objectives of this presentation is to analyse the strengths and weaknesses of new media, apply these strengths and weaknesses to the case study of the Ukraine war, and finally, what can be done to ensure social media reporting can be successful in the future. The key terms that will be discussed throughout this presentation include globalization, the expansion of diverse forms of economic, political, and cultural activity beyond national borders, social media, websites, and applications which enable users to create and share content or to participate in social networking. Mainstream media decimated via the largest distribution channels, which therefore represent what the majority of media consumers are likely to encounter. So some of the advantages of social media being used as a news source or as news sharing. Social media being used as a news source has many advantages. Social media users are exposed to multiple views and sources and opinions, which you would not typically achieve through traditional or mainstream media. Typically with mainstream media, newspapers are often trying to push a certain narrative, which is less likely to happen online as you have multiple different sources being advertised to you constantly. It also creates a discursive space for deliberation and action mobilization for social movements. It enables us to question and challenge existing power relations. It's a platform for social and political change. Social media allows for information to be mobilized more quickly. Social media users are exposed to multiple sources and opinions. Social media news also allows for complicated news stories to be broken down and explained. News is also more accessible to people who may not have access to newspapers, TVs, and paid mainstream media. The social media reporting brings a new style of reporting, which is storytelling. It is a more empathetic and realism type of style. It represents issues and events which oppose those offered in mainstream media and advocating social and political reform. So applying this to our case study of the Ukraine war, it brings the war right into our pockets and shows us the reality of the war, as opposed to when you're watching it on TV or just have it in a newspaper. You often chose when you got to see that, as opposed to now when it's always with you and it's always around. A study conducted by Talbally found that there was a significant positive correlation between social media storytelling and help received among Nigerian refugees in the Russian-Ukraine war. Users get a daily insight into what stories are like, and as opposed to just getting the facts. A good example of this is the TikTok account at Valerish, who goes through her daily life as a Ukraine refugee and returning to life back in the Ukraine. So some of the negatives of social media being used as a news sharing platform. It does have a lot of disadvantages. In 2016, Barack Obama said social media could erode democracy. It is a new type of news deliverance it is a new type of news deliverance that we are only just beginning to see. We may not even know what most of the disadvantages of this is, as it is such a new concept. It's a new type of news deliverance. Traditionally, news deliverance has occurred a one-way sender to receiver fashion and lacked the capability of obtaining rapid feedback from their audience. Now, audiences are immediately able to share their thoughts and opinions on stories. So, moving on to our first negative, which is news information overload. This occurs when the consumer feels overwhelmed with the sheer amount of news they're consuming. This may lead to news avoidance or selective exposure. When a participant feels highly overloaded with the information they receive on social media, it is more likely they would selectively expose themselves to a certain news source, perhaps a source that they trust more. This is a negative because you won't get as many opinions and different sources telling you different reporting on the same story. Those who felt highly overloaded with news agreed that with the idea that increased time is needed to be spent on accurate news reporting. This puts journalism in jeopardy as people tend to not believe what they're reading anymore because they feel like it's being produced so quickly. So the negatives continue. Journalistic transparency is compromised. News consumers nowadays are likely to form distinct patterns of news consumption and have different perceptions of journalistic norms and the practice of news production. So traditionally, news consumers wouldn't have seen the behind the scenes of what makes a story. So with this being so transparent these days, people are less likely to engage with it and believe it because they see the behind the scenes process. Journalists also nowadays actively share their opinions online, whether it be directly in the article that they're writing, or it could be on tweets or in captions of videos. This puts journalism transparency into jeopardy as individual biases may become evident to the consumers, which makes the consumer not trust the source as much, as they believe that an underlying narrative might be being conveyed. So finally, it's an increased risk of fake news. So fake news is not a new concept. Janet Cook and Stephen Glass are two famous examples of fake news being spread and believed. It may not take enough time and effort to check with the validity of certain information that could be false. This is due to the quick turnaround of news stories these days. Exposure to fake news sources, coupled with the exposure to real news on social media, may also lead to the news information overload, which we did discuss earlier. So application to this to the case study again. So evidence of fake news stories. During the beginning of the Ukraine war, there was a lot of fake news stories going around. This included videos of a soldier parachuting, which emerged on TikTok and quickly got over 20 million views. A lot of people believe this was Russia invading the Ukraine. However, with a quick investigation by CNN, they found that the same video was posted in August 2015 by an Instagram account with the same username and what looked to be the same profile picture as the TikTok account. And then another example of it was multiple videos also showed Russian aircraft flying in formations above Moscow. But after CNN did a quick reverse image search, they found that these photos and videos were also dated, and it was from a company who offered fly-arounds over Moscow. So what are companies doing to go against or prevent fake news stories like this? So Facebook last year set up the Special Operations Center to remove content that violates our community standards faster. So what this essentially was fact checking to ensure that Ukraine stories that were coming out were actually true. And then Twitter shared a number of tips on how to identify false news as well. So how can we combat these problems early on to ensure that social media reporting can continue in a safe and sustainable way? So firstly, what is media literacy? It is the ability to access, understand, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms. So why should we learn media literacy? It is an essential tool to question the world around us and the information we're receiving both consciously and subconsciously. A study conducted found that 82% of middle school students couldn't tell the difference between sponsored articles and real news stories. And this is a really alarming, as this is a future generation and they should be able to quickly identify what the underlying messages of a article is saying. So a book by Diabru says that there's 5 concepts in understanding media literacy, and these include: all media messages are constructed. Media messages are constructed using creative language with its own rules. 3, different people experience the same media messages differently. 4, the media have embedded values and different points of view. And 5, media messages are constructed to gain profit and or power. So the first point there all media messages are constructed. So this is important to know who created the message. Every message has a purpose and a target, for example, to increase sales, which we'll go through a little bit later on as well. It has an ideal customer in mind. For example, a boutique hotel wouldn't advertise the same way that a budget hotel or a hostel would also advertise. So the second one, a creative language and its own rules. So specific devices are used for specific audiences. For example, companies use different techniques. So if they're advertising to children versus adults, for children, they'd use bright colors, shapes to attract the attention of a child. And then different experiences. Everyone's thoughts and opinions are shaped by race, gender, upbringing, background, etc. And people need to be reminded that it's not only one correct representation, and not all media representations are accurate as well. So embedded values and point of views. So question who is produced the piece and what messages are they trying to send, and also is there an underlying tone or message being sent throughout the article as well. And number 5 is media messages are constructed to gain power or profits. So why was the message sent, and was it to increase profits? So to conclude then, social media overall is having a positive effect on news sharing. Users are getting exposed to new opinions, stories that they may not have seen prior due to the story not being covered by mainstream media. Social media also allows us to voice opinions directly and question decision makers immediately. And the news also has become simplified and accessible to a lot more people. And social media as a news platform also aids globalization by making the world more interconnected. However, it also must be noted that there are disadvantages for becoming a news platform. This includes users sharing, experiencing news information overload, which could lead to news avoidance and selective exposure. With increased social media reporting, there is also an increased risk of fake news stories appearing more frequent and becoming more believable, which we did see with the TikTok and Ukraine stories. Journalistic transparency is also questioned. As journalists, you have a responsibility to be impartial. However, with journalists sharing their opinions online, it risks journalists' integrity. So going forward, to ensure social media reporting standards are upheld, it is imperative that we must prioritize teaching news and media literacy and how to identify fake news. So thank you very much for listening, and here are some of my sources that I've used throughout the presentation. I hope you enjoyed.